So the Microgrid State Working Group has been active for almost 4 years now. And during those 4 years, we've seen a lot of interest from policymakers in our member states in resilience investments. We've seen several of the state energy offices and public utility commissions launch programs or proceedings based to improve the deployment of microgrids within the states. And so we thought that 4 years on, it would be helpful to develop a report that summarizes some of the common approaches that we've seen from state energy offices and public utility commissions as a resource for other states that are considering developing their own strategies. So that was the objective behind developing this framework. So the framework discusses some of the general steps that state energy offices and commissions take and highlights some of the common challenges that they encounter through the regulatory and program design processes. The goal is really to help states build on and learn from the efforts of their peers, and also to aid stakeholders in understanding what role public utility commissions and state energy offices play in the microgrid landscape. So we started with a discussion of the landscape for microgrids across states. Before embarking on a new program or a regulatory effort, we think there's value for state energy offices and public utility commissions in assessing several factors that influence the urgency and the objectives of microgrid initiatives. So the first is reliability. Are outages frequent, long in duration, or do they impact large numbers of customers? And how exactly is quality of service impacted? The next is resilience threats. So what are the actual threat factors that are impacting utility service? And are microgrids a feasible solution to protect customers and communities from these risks? We can think about 4 ways of improving resilience: reducing the magnitude of the disruption, extending the system's duration of resistance, reducing the duration of a disruption, and reducing the duration of recovery to a pre-disturbance level of service. So where are microgrids actually able to contribute? The next is customer outlook. What types of customers do we expect to procure microgrids? Is it aggregations of residential customers, municipalities, large commercial and industrial customers, educational campuses, or other types of customers? Next, market structure. What types of entities are expected to participate in the market for microgrids? Are there standardized interconnection agreements to facilitate the ease of microgrid deployment? And will community-owned microgrids become subject to state regulation? The next is utility business model, whether or not utilities can own and or operate certain components of microgrids or entire microgrids meeting certain characteristics. How should multi-customer microgrids be planned, regulated, and financed? That's a big area of interest for many states. And can microgrids access value streams and additional revenue from participating in wholesale markets? And finally, state policy goals. Is the state working to achieve clean energy, electrification, affordability, resilience, or reliability, or other types of goals with the energy system? Are there specific carve-outs or targets for distributed energy resources or microgrids in particular? And can microgrids aid in the achievement of these goals? And how do they fit into broader state plans centered around resilience, clean energy, and energy security?
Thanks, Kiera. So in the report, we do try to provide an overview of different legislative activity. While legislation is not the only option to move microgrid policies, programs, and regulations forward, governors and state legislatures do often direct, especially state energy offices, to conduct studies or set up grant programs that support microgrid investments or project development. The legislature may also require the PUC to establish a microgrid tariff or undertake a proceeding to streamline or improve microgrid regulations. There are also plenty of opportunities for the state legislature, the energy office, and the PUC to coordinate and work together on the implementation of different programs or microgrid priorities. And so in this report and framework, we really wanted to highlight a few relevant legislative examples that would be of interest to state energy offices and PUCs. So first off, in California, we looked at Senate Bill 1339, which was enacted in 2018, and it directs the PUC to work with the Energy Office and CAISO on a variety of different microgrid related activities, such as developing microgrid service standards, reducing barriers to deployment, setting up and forming a working group, and also creating a standard that helps to streamline the interconnection process. And California has taken several really great actions since 2018, including the PUC initiating a new rulemaking and organizing a working group. And there's also been a microgrid tariff set up and an incentive program for microgrids established. And so within the framework, we go into a little bit more detail on these different activities and how they were shaped with the legislation. Next, Colorado has passed quite a bit of relevant legislation, one of which requires the Colorado State Energy Office and Department of Local Affairs to develop an electric grid resilience and reliability roadmap that, among other issues, will cover potential legislative, administrative, statutory, or rule changes around microgrids, and also look at microgrid related issues such as cost benefit, stakeholder outreach, and other resilience questions. Additional legislation was passed in Colorado that established the Colorado Microgrids for Community Resilience Grant Program. And this program is limited to rural electric cooperatives and municipal utilities and focuses on microgrids that will help not only with resilience, but also reducing risk from natural disasters. And so we do more of a deep dive on the Colorado program throughout the framework. In Oregon, the Community Renewable Energy Grant Program provides funding to the planning and development of different clean energy projects, some of which are microgrids. And the program has gone through several iterations, but one of the really big priorities and focus points of the program is its work to ensure equity and community engagement were prioritized through outreach to community members and also through the work of an advisory committee. So this program is really one we want to spotlight as a potential model for other states, particularly interested in some of those energy justice and community engagement questions. And finally, in North Carolina, SB 509 was passed in 2021, and it creates a revenue fund for the State Energy Office to, among other things, provide technical assistance to support communities in actually conducting needs assessments of potential areas to site clean energy microgrids that address resilience concerns. So these are just a couple examples of legislation that has led to either State Energy Office or PUC activities, and we encourage you to read more information in the framework to get a better understanding of how the legislation came to be and what the impact was on the state at large. Next slide. So now I'm just going to take some time to touch on some of the shared interests and needs of both PUCs and state energy offices when establishing a microgrid program, policy, or regulation. And these really center around stakeholder engagement and technical assistance. Here at NASEO and NARUC, we really see the value in stakeholder outreach and engagement when developing a state microgrid policy or program, really for communities, utilities, and other key players to get an opportunity to share concerns about the program and provide input into the structure early in the process. And so while this kind of engagement process will be approached differently in different states and by different offices within those states, some of the considerations we talk through in the report are how states are defining disadvantaged communities, particularly when looking at microgrid grant programs, what the location of critical facilities might be. Some states hosted public comment forums to get input from community members and local governments on which facilities should be eligible for a specific grant. There also may be questions around state goals and priorities and just the ultimate goal of the microgrid program. And as I mentioned, there are a few ways to actually get this information from stakeholders. One is releasing a request for information, which almost every state has done in the initial stages of their microgrid grant program, or hosting stakeholder and community outreach events. Just a couple of quick examples. In 2021, the state of Rhode Island released a request for information on their proposed municipal microgrid program. And they collected feedback on a few different things, but one of which is how to actually define the public benefit of a microgrid, as well as just the general program structure and criteria. And then when it comes to stakeholder and community outreach events, West Virginia, in partnership with the Smart Electric Power Alliance in developing their regional Microgrids for Resilience study, held a few different stakeholder meetings that really helped them identify what critical facilities they should be classifying and including in the study. So really, given the complexities of microgrid programs, policies, and regulations, beyond that stakeholder engagement question and getting input from community members and utilities, it really can be valuable for state energy offices and PUCs to get outside technical assistance. And within the framework, we touch on some of the available opportunities and suggestions, but really quickly, technical assistance may be available through grants from state and federal agencies or even from the private sector. And this can lead to state agencies being able to bring on additional staff with more targeted expertise or experience, or also provide states with the opportunity to engage in information sharing or attend educational events. States may also want to look just to the national labs or to DOE for technical assistance. There are a lot of tools, modeling tools, technical reports available to the public, and states should be taking advantage of those tools as often as possible. Finally, there are also resources out there to help address cybersecurity concerns. Beyond just microgrids, this is a priority topic for many state energy offices and PUCs. And so just for one example, NASEO and NARUC led a joint cybersecurity advisory team for state solar that brings together state energy offices, PUCs, and the private sector to really share challenges and opportunities and develop actionable tools. So we hope that these can be resources for states as they develop microgrid programs and look to address some of the potential cybersecurity concerns. Next slide. So while those shared interests like stakeholder engagement and technical assistance are really critical throughout the process of developing a state microgrid program or policy, the framework that NASEO and NARUC have released really focuses on two deep dives. It includes one deep dive into the steps and key considerations for state energy offices and one for PUCs. So I just wanted to walk through some of the steps that are relevant to state energy offices and that they may be interested in potentially following when it's setting up a program. So just a disclaimer that these might not be applicable to every state, or they may need to be modified or rearranged to fit your state's structure and goals. But we really tried to model these after successful and established programs to provide lessons learned and background on potential challenges for other states. So as you can see on this slide, we encourage states to consider the following process. First, really thinking about how you want to define relevant terms. That could be just the word microgrid, it could be resilience, it could be multi-property microgrid. It's really important to understand both how the state views these items, and it provides clarity for potential applicants to a program to really understand what potential projects fall under that definition. It's also important to really define program strategy early on. There are a lot of different reasons a state might be setting up a microgrid program. Many might overlap, but just a couple examples of how other states have defined their program strategy. They've looked at how microgrids can expand access in underserved communities. They've looked at how microgrids can enhance resilience for critical facilities. Also thinking about microgrids and their role in potentially reducing energy costs or expanding access to renewable energy, among others. And next, we really think state energy offices can explore funding and financing options. These are available both to fund an actual program or to fund actual microgrid projects. And we talk through both considerations within the framework. So for a program, funds may come from the state legislature, which is what occurred with Colorado's program. They may come from an executive order from the governor, or even from state energy program funds, which are administered by the Department of Energy. And Wisconsin actually utilized these state energy program funds to fund microgrid feasibility studies through their state microgrid program. And both West Virginia and Kentucky utilized similar funds for their microgrid feasibility study that looked at critical facilities across the state. And when it comes to financing specific projects, there are a few avenues, including public-private partnerships, federal funding, including under the recent IIJA and IRA. And then there are also state financing programs such as revolving loan funds, green banks, and other mechanisms. And while we do touch on these items in a bit of detail in this report, we also recommend folks check out a previous NASEO and NARUC publication that really does a deep dive and comprehensively looks at all these different funding and financing opportunities available to states. So next, we really think states should be engaging with local governments, with investor and consumer-owned utilities, and the private sector. We've really found that based on their position in the state government, state energy offices are really well positioned to convene these groups. And they also particularly have strong relationships with consumer-owned utilities like municipal utilities or rural electric cooperatives. Next programs will usually involve a competitive application process to determine who will actually be receiving the grant funds, how much they'll be receiving, and for what kind of projects. So states may want to release an RFI, as I mentioned earlier, to really get input into the application structure and requirements. This is especially important when thinking about those energy justice and equity considerations, really making sure an application is fair, accessible, that any community member or utility, private sector company that's eligible is able to access and understand the information needed in the application. Our framework also includes examples of both existing and previous state energy microgrid program applications and RFIs for other states to review. After that, we really think it's important for states to think about setting objectives for their programs. You know, microgrid projects really cover a wide range of applications and locations within a state, and we want to make sure that they're supporting both site-specific, community, and statewide goals. So these projects can also be an opportunity for states to think about opportunities to test, you know, kind of innovative microgrid configurations like co-locating EV chargers in microgrids. There also may be an interest in funding only feasibility studies versus the entire project development process, but in the report, we really walk through some of the ways that states may weigh which approach to take based on things like risk, cost, and other considerations. So after an application has been finalized and a program is ready to launch, state energy offices will need to prepare to draft and release a request for proposals or a funding opportunity announcement. And these should cover things like who's actually eligible, what the eligibility requirements are, what the parameters for the program are, what the selection criteria is. Also really make clear what deadlines are. If there's a pre-application process, like a concept paper, make that very clear from the beginning, what the required forms are, and also what kind of assistance is available to applicants to help complete the forms. There also should be information on how certain terms are defined. So as we mentioned earlier, if a state has decided to pass a statewide legislation or have just through the program strategy define microgrid in a certain way, this should be clearly laid out at this point in the program. It'll also talk about what the review process will look like, how much funding is available and for who. And also states should really be thinking about what level of technical data is required, because this can differ depending on both the goals of the program and really just based on how much info states want on hand before selecting recipients. And it's important also to consider that the more technical an application is, that it could be more limiting to potential applicants, especially from disadvantaged communities or local governments without a lot of staff on hand. After this, we really think that, with these state energy office grant programs usually being competitive programs with applicants selected based on both their application and how it aligns with the considerations of a potential review committee or previously established criteria, a review committee can really be helpful in providing support and making sure that applications are being considered from a wide range of different perspectives, and to support the state in ensuring that perspectives from environmental justice communities, from utilities, from the private sector, from economic development agencies are all being considered and incorporated into the review process. Some states have also used a ranking scale to rate proposals with the establishment of certain metrics around equity, resilience, et cetera, which can be helpful in getting applications into some kind of order for ultimate selection. So finally, next steps and metrics for success should be considered. State energy offices should be prepared to provide both continued support and engagement with all of their awardees. This will be an ongoing process until a project is complete or a feasibility study. And while metrics for success are varied, a state really should be aware of their own goals and a timeline for the project in advance, which can be helpful in mitigating potential delays or funding concerns. And states may also wish to have applicants submit quarterly reports or host quarterly meetings with the project team to address any potential obstacles or questions before they escalate. And this is also a great opportunity for states to just kind of get an update on where the project stands and if any other resources are needed to move the project across the finish line. So it is hard to really boil all this down in one webinar, but the report really goes into these different steps in much more detail. And we also include a lot of state-specific examples in the text, which can be really helpful in seeing how other state energy offices got their programs off the ground, what the process looked like, actually see links to specific RFPs and specific advisory committee and application criteria information. So we really encourage everyone to actually read through the report and get a better understanding of how other states have approached this process. So I'll turn it over to Kiera to talk through some of the PUC considerations.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. And yeah, similarly, we developed an example regulatory process that we observed public utility commissions going through some or all of these steps commonly when undertaking proceedings relating to microgrids. So I'll talk through these steps and provide some state examples. So first, commissions might start by assessing the presence of regulatory barriers to microgrids. A common example is the definition of a utility or of a public utility, which generally includes any entity that sells electricity to an external customer, or rules prohibiting non-utilities from distributing electricity across rights of way, such as from one customer to another. So Maine statute created an exemption for microgrids from the definition of a public utility to try to facilitate the development of microgrids for projects that meet certain characteristics. The PUC also has to find that the microgrid is within the public interest. Another example is California. California regulations define an electric micro-utility as an electrical corporation regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission and organized for the purpose of providing sole source generation, distribution, and sale of electricity exclusively to a customer base of less than 2,000 customers. However, the CPUC earlier this year rejected an application from a microgrid developer to function as a micro-utility, saying that the applicant was seeking unauthorized exemptions from CPUC rate regulations and did not provide the commission with adequate information. So that may be addressed in a future rulemaking, but I don't think that's actively under consideration at the commission. It is important to note, though, that in California, bilateral procurement agreements between microgrids and distribution utilities are permissible. The CPUC affirmed the authority of San Diego Gas and Electric to obtain up to 6 megawatts of electricity and grid reliability services from a microgrid owned and sited at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar during generation shortfalls. The utility paid the base for power and grid services with funds generated from electricity ratepayers. The base successfully provided electricity to approximately 3,000 homes in San Diego to avoid broader outages during some hot weather conditions in August of 2022 that resulted in some grid constraints. So for a commission undertaking a proceeding, generally we start with a scoping order, which would set out the objectives and prioritization of issues, a procedural schedule, the assignment of commissioners, commission staff, administrative law judges, and other commission staff and resources to specific roles, and the establishment of working groups to make technical and policy recommendations to the commission for their consideration. So an example that we use here is in Hawaii. In 2018, the Hawaii legislature passed Act 200, an act relating to resiliency, which directed the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission to establish a microgrid services tariff to encourage and facilitate the development and use of energy resilient microgrids. The PUC was charged with developing a microgrid services tariff to expediently integrate resilient and renewable energy into the grid. Priorities for the program included islanding of microgrids during extreme weather events and outages to improve grid resilience, standardizing interconnection language to facilitate broader adoption of microgrids, and exploring market opportunities for customers to pursue microgrid projects. So the commission opened an investigatory docket in order number 2018-0163 to investigate the establishment of a microgrid services tariff and initiate a scoping order for this proceeding. And ultimately, the scoping order that came out scheduled technical conferences to identify the critical issues to address during the proceeding, and it also set deadlines for opening and reply briefs. Procedural schedules are often revisited and changed during a proceeding as commissioners and staff develop a better understanding of how complex the issues are within the scope of the proceeding and how united or diverse the perspectives of named parties and stakeholders might be. The Hawaii PUC issued a subsequent order establishing a procedural schedule to convene 2 working groups that would consider a variety of key issues identified in its previous order. This order also set expectations for working group participation and scheduled regular status updates from each of the working groups to the commission. The next phase is stakeholder input, and this can generally happen in 3 different avenues: workshops, written comments, and technical working groups. So the example that we used here was from the District of Columbia's initiative to modernize the energy delivery system for increased sustainability, or MEDSIS, which worked in 2 phases to identify technologies and policies to aid in policy goals around grid modernization and clean energy. And microgrids played a major role in this effort. So in the first phase of MEDSIS, the DC Public Service Commission held technical workshops and town hall meetings. They issued a staff report identifying regulatory barriers to grid modernization and also developed a framework for the initiative, and they put forth a vision statement and guiding principles. Moving into phase 2, the commission hired a facilitator, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA, to facilitate 6 different working groups, one of which was focused on microgrids. And the microgrids working group aimed to address microgrid development by examining costs and benefits and providing recommendations on ownership, operations, standards, and implementation. So following the conclusion of the second phase with a final working group report that was submitted to the Public Service Commission in May of 2019, commission staff issued a proposed order in August of 2019 opening the next phase of grid mod work in DC, which was known as Power Path. And the proposed order summarized the findings of the microgrid working group and noted, because of the vast differences in types of microgrids, as well as the current statutory framework of the commission, microgrid regulation presents the most controversial and challenging subject for the commission. The commission is still working through many of these issues. Next would be receiving proposals and comments from utilities and replies from stakeholders. So the example we used here was from California. In California's microgrids and resilience proceeding, the state's 3 investor-owned utilities developed a proposed implementation plan for a microgrid incentive program, which was authorized by a January 2021 CPUC decision. And this is based on the implementation of Senate Bill 1339, which Kelsey mentioned earlier. So the CPUC envisioned the microgrid incentive program as a $200 million program to support the critical needs of vulnerable communities that were impacted by grid outages, and to test new technologies or regulatory approaches to inform future action. The utilities proposal included summaries of input they received during public workshops, an overview of their preferred process to develop qualifying microgrids for the incentive program, eligibility criteria, evaluation scoring procedures, and areas for further discussion or clarification by the Commission. So next, proposed decision, where the Commission would propose a decision for public review and comment. So the example that we used was, again, back in DC. The Commission issued an order following the working group report, stating that a pending case before the Commission, formal case number 1163, was expected to provide some more clarity on the scope of the Commission's jurisdiction over microgrids and whether they act within the definition of a public utility according to DC code. So in this case, which is still active, the Public Service Commission proposed classifying multi-customer or multi-meter microgrids as electric companies subject to regulatory authority, meaning such microgrids would be required to apply for certificates of public convenience and necessity and receive Public Service Commission approval for their rates. So at least one microgrid developer has expressed interest in advancing down this path, although others have expressed hesitancy to act until the Commission comes to a decision on this proposed rule. And finally, issuing a final order. So again, back to California, in April of 2023, the Commission approved rules for the Microgrid Incentive Program. They ultimately allocated approximately $80 million for Pacific Gas and Electric, another $80 million for Southern California Edison, and about $20 million for San Diego Gas and Electric. And projects that are selected under the incentive program can receive up to $15 million in award funding. And coming up next, the Commission expects utilities to develop a Microgrid Incentive Program handbook for prospective applicants in October, and then open the first application window for the incentive program in July of 2024. And we also included a box for future filings. So a Commission's order might very well direct utilities or other stakeholders to submit future reports to the Commission, progress updates. The Commission could also consider the initiation of new dockets or new tracks within the same docket to resolve issues that have come up in the proceeding. And so we included in the framework a number of deep dives, kind of telling the full story start to finish of the state examples that we cited throughout. So I know I've focused on Hawaii and California in the previous slide, but for those interested in the framework, there is kind of a walkthrough starting from the legislation, coming into the orders that were released most recently when we published the paper. Kelsey, anything to add on Connecticut?
Yeah, so just as Kiera mentioned, we do a deep dive on a few specific programs from the State Energy Office perspective. We really look at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environment's Microgrid Grant and Loan Program. Just for everyone's awareness, we look at kind of what the enabling legislation looked like, what the primary objectives for the program are, and then walk through key actions from the State Energy Office, you know, thinking about what the timeline was for releasing an RFI, what the actual language including in the RFI was, what kind of stakeholder meetings they hosted, the fact that they actually released project feasibility applications before the final application, and a few other considerations. And I think these are just really helpful examples for other states interested in developing their own program to look at and really see, you know, how did the program start? Where is it now? And what were some of the unique and innovative approaches they took, as well as what were any challenges or barriers they experienced in the process. So definitely recommend checking out those tables towards the end of the report.
Yep, and I'll add also that we include examples from many states, not just Connecticut, Hawaii, and California throughout the report. But we just felt like it was helpful to walk through kind of the full story of these three programs. All right, so we can pause for questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to submit in the Q&A box. And I think Kelsey's placed a link to the framework in the chat. We also have web pages within the NARUC and NASEO websites that include all of our previous resources, We've put out a number of other reports through the Microgrid State Working Group focusing on particular questions, so encourage folks to check those out. Great. While folks are maybe thinking about questions, I will move to the next slide, which talks about an upcoming state action planning workshop that we are supporting in October. So NARUC and NASEO will be hosting a state microgrid action planning workshop on October 3rd and 4th in Bethesda, Silver Spring, Maryland, in the DC area. The objectives are to bring state energy offices and public utility commissions together for peer sharing and information exchange on the programmatic policy and regulatory opportunities and barriers for microgrid development, spotlight some of the innovative state actions that have led to successful microgrid installations, and conduct some action planning and identify next steps for state members to accelerate the deployment of microgrids in support of other state priorities like grid resilience and transportation electrification. This workshop will include a tour of a microgrid in Silver Spring, Maryland, that supports electric bus charging for the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. So we'll see that and then come back to our hotel in Bethesda for an afternoon workshop on October 3rd, continuing into the morning of October 4th. And I think we can put the registration link into the chat. Yeah, Jeff has done that. Thanks, Jeff. So this is open to state members only. So if you're at a state energy office or a public utility commission, please feel free to register whether or not you're formally a member of the Microgrid State Working Group. For other folks, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me and Kelsey.
Yeah, and I would just add that we're going to try to do more of a deeper look at the framework at the workshop, and we'll have some time for state action planning, as Kiera mentioned, and we'd really love to support a few states in actually working through the framework to develop their own program or regulation. So hopefully we can chat more about that at the workshop.
All right. With that, here is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us. I know everyone is probably excited to log off for Labor Day, so I hope you all enjoy your long weekends. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the framework. Please do share with us any feedback or further questions that you might have.
Thanks, everyone.